introduction. Thank you. For some reason last night, Eric was telling me about the lights here. It's true, eh? They really are bright. And thank you guys for hanging around. First I'd say to everybody, I'd say thanks for having me. I'd say thanks to Sala, thanks to Scarp, and thanks to all the organizers. Thanks to everybody who's took some time to organize this lovely event in this spectacular venue. I was sitting up for the afternoon on the listening to a lot of the talks, and I was just impressed about how thoughtful and how considerate and how well thought through many of the presentations were. So thank you very much for that to all the presenters, and I'm sorry I couldn't have been here for the whole weekend. I was able to catch for the whole couple days. I was only able to catch the afternoon, but nicely done to everybody. And I would also say Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock is maybe not the most ideal time for a talk. For me, I'm fine. I'm great. For you guys are gangsters out here, hanging in there all the way through. So thanks very much for your time, and I appreciate your indulgence of me here for a little bit. I'll try to get us out of here with some kind of alacrity. It's closing in on the end day, and I'm sure you're all thinking about a beer. So I'll see what I can do to bring us home all right. And I would like to say, for this entire event, and for all my work here, not just at UBC, but all throughout East Vancouver and throughout the Lower Mainland, that it's really important to acknowledge that we're on unceded, traditional, occupied territory of the Coast Salish people, specifically Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Stolo, and Squamish people. And my thanks to them and my gratitude for them hosting us on their territory. So thank you. We'll see. And I guess I got a couple of points for you. I got a couple of things I'd like to offer. The first thing, Eric gave me this iPad here to keep time, and I'm already panicking about it. Oh, there we go. All right, I'll work it. I kind of want to pick up where I left off. I gave a talk last year at Scarp Symposium, and I kind of want to pick up. I'm not sure if any of you were there, but I kind of want to pick up where I left off. And the talk that I gave was a short talk, but it's something that's been framing much of my thinking for the last several years, which is that a slow dawning realization of what has happened to my neighborhood, what has happened to my work in East Vancouver. I arrived here in East Vancouver in 1990, and I've lived within about three blocks for that entire time. I've raised my family right around Bocce Ball Park in East Vancouver. And over the course of those 2.5 decades, I've spent a tremendous amount of time and effort almost exclusively engaged in community activism and organizing. I've done a number of things, many of which I immodestly am real proud of. Me and my partner have started schools. We've started community events like Car Free Days. We've organized youth centers. We've done a whole number of potluck and feeding exercises around homelessness and working with folks that are underfed in the neighborhood. We've done a whole wide range of community activism, participatory organizing, and community efforts. And the slow dawning realization that has struck me with a certain amount of horror is that the more successful I and my colleagues and all of us who are working to improve my neighborhood in East Vancouver, or in East Vancouver in general, or Vancouver as a city, ultimately betray us. The more effective my work is in East Vancouver, the more effective all of our work is, the more we contribute to the neighborhood, the more likely it is that neighborhood becomes attractive. The more that neighborhood becomes attractive, the funkier it gets, the more livable it gets, the more the capital wants to buy in. And what I've seen in my neighborhood over the last 20 years is that my efforts, immodestly again, and I hope you'll tolerate me for it, I think have been very successful in many ways. And in many ways, the more successful that I am, I've betrayed myself, my neighbors, and my family by contributing to a neighborhood to which capital is extremely interested in. My neighborhood now is prominently featured in real estate brochures, trumpeting the edginess, the vibrancy, the culturalness of the neighborhood. I've seen every day my mailbox probably like your mailbox, is full of fancy little brochures talking about how property got sold, how many properties got sold, how much over the asking price it got sold. I'm not very good with PowerPoint, I'm sorry to say. I'm not much of a visual guy. My apologies for that. But on my way out, just as I was running down the stairs today, I grabbed a couple. This one here just says 229 Parker Street. This is just literally on my way out. I just reached into my mailbox and pulled them out. This is 2229 Parker Street. Michelle Comans has sold it from Remax, has sold a nice little kind of blue and red bungalow just up the street from me that sold for $340,000 over the asking price. Didn't mention what the asking price was, but she's got a listing of a whole bunch of properties here that were sold for vast amounts of money. I'm not really sure how much, but I don't really like reading those too much. Not that long ago, I can remember when $340,000 would have been considered exorbitant, period, for this house. $340,000 over the asking price is something pretty significant. There's others. I'm sure I don't need to recount all these. I'm sure you've been talking about these, and I'm sure they've been the object of endless coffee table and dinner table and party conversations for a long time. There's a nice little, just in case you're interested in my neighborhood of Commercial Drive, though, there's just listed, the half duplex you've been waiting for. It's a 3-bedroom home on 1833 Napier Street. It's going right now for $1.198 million, and it's going to be available to you in, hopefully it's not too much over the asking price. But so I'm curious then. I'm really, really curious about the circumstances and the contours that have led to this particular circumstance where I find myself in a particular kind of paralysis, where I worry and that I am in many ways, well, paralyzed is a lot, in many ways, I think is an accurate rendition of it. I am paralyzed by the notion that every activity, every initiative, every project, every community organizing that I attempt may in fact be ultimately turned into a weapon against myself and my family. And I am unsure how to move. And I'm interested into the circumstances that have led to me, like so many of us, have found ourselves in. So in that context, I'd like to talk a little bit to you about, just a little tiny bit about Vancouver and something more about Portland. In part because those are the two cities that I know the most about, but also because those two cities are considered in many ways the gold standard in urban design. There are two cities whenever you travel, whenever you talk in urbanist circles and urban design circles, those are two cities, that I'm sure you've heard many times. Oh, those are pretty cities. Those are cities that really get it right. And in some ways, that is true. And those are also two cities that are convulsed by gentrification, by displacement, by dispossession. And I am interested in the confluence of those two circumstances. And I think Vancouver, just for a moment, I think that Vancouver is lauded as a well-designed city for all kinds of really good reasons. There are all kinds of lovely, attractive, very laudable, very commendable parts of Vancouver, and I think in many ways there is a lot of the urban design of Vancouver that is worth emulating in many ways. And again, I will argue that as currently constituted, those successes are distinctly to Vancouver's detriment. I think because, and I don't have to talk too much more about what you know about Vancouver already. You know about the unearned privilege. You know about the accumulation. You know about the accumulation by dispossession. You know about the displacement. You know about the dislocation between wealth and income. You know about the spectacular conundrums that thinking about Vancouver places us all in. When I asked a very well-known architect of the city about this one time, he told me, and I'm going to quote, he said, "We nailed everything. We just missed the affordability part." I said, "Oh yeah, no shit, buddy." And in many ways, the city is an exemplar of design in the service of private accumulation and displacement. Beautiful amenities available to the highly privileged. A very pretty city that, of course, has emerged as the least affordable city in North America and as a case study in dispossession. There's a school, just as a small kind of tangential story, but there's a school in New York City that for many years invited me to come talk. For a variety of reasons that I'm still not exactly clear on. and I'll leave the name out just out of respect. But the school is a beautiful school. They have 2 campuses on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. A lower school for grades 1 to 5, and an upper school from 6 to 12. And the high school where I go speak is spectacular. It's unbelievable school. It's the kind of school that you would love to go to. It's a school that any of us would love to send our children to. It's a progressive school. It's got all kinds of democratic features. The building is spectacular. There's a gorgeous green roof. There are unbelievable theater facilities. There's a gym. The teachers are all kind of cool, young MA students with good energy and tattoos and piercings. There are no classes. The kids move around in packs of 5 or 6 with a cool teacher and a smart board. There's field trips like you can't believe. The school is a wonderful, wonderful, beautiful school. And every time I go there, I get welcomed by the nicest, politest, coolest people you can imagine. We go and have lunch downstairs. The school cafeteria is run by a chef with his own TV show and a cookbook. The food is unbelievable. You don't even want to leave the cafeteria. I'm like, why does anybody even go home from this school? The school is beautiful. And everybody seems to be doing fantastic. And the school, of course, the money shot that you're waiting for is that the school is $47,000 a year to go to. And I go, and I often am asked to talk to the student body, and I sometimes go and talk to the staff, and the staff is enormous. The staff is like 200 people, and they're lovely, smart, interesting people. And this is one of the most important progressive institutions and educational institutions in the country. And I try to make an argument to them, and I say, my friends, I feel bad talking like this, but if you are creating a beautiful, wonderful facility and an unbelievable educational experience for the most privileged people in world history, that is a regressive project, not a progressive project. You believe yourself to be a progressive school because it's democratically run in many ways. It's got all kinds of progressive pedagogical apparatuses. They treat their kids with utmost respect. But it's only available to a very small number of people. And those people are already people who have everything in the world. And they say, well, how can we fund this? How can we fund this beautiful thing? And I say, I don't know, it's not my problem. But it makes me think of Vancouver. I think almost the exact same things I think about that school as I think about Vancouver. And I think that that school, my experience of that school, and my experience of Vancouver similarly, is a particular kind of subsuming of form before politics, creating beautiful experiences and pretty baubles for privileged people. And that experience, of course, has led to a very particular urban form in Vancouver, a particular form that you're familiar with and is common in cities across North America, whereby working class, middle class, poor residents, immigrants, refugees of all kinds, are slowly being forced further and further to the edges of the city. There is a centrifugalness to the city, spinning out its residents to the furthest edges. I spend my time as a community organizer, and 20 years ago, when I met a poor single mother on social assistance, it was inevitably in Mount Pleasant, it was on Commercial Drive, it was in Hastings Sunrise. Now, every time I meet that person, it's 20 minutes by bus from Metrotown. It's a half an hour walk to Guilford Mall. It's in some place in Surrey I've never even heard of and can't even find on Google Maps. That poverty is no longer an accoutrement of the inner city. Poverty is becoming a centrifugal spin-off in cities across North America and almost nowhere else more so than in Vancouver. And so what we're seeing now is a very interesting both suburbanization of poverty and a simultaneous racialization of the suburbs. So where my current work is most interested in working with young refugee and immigrant youth, primarily gang-involved youth, almost all of that happens in the suburbs for reasons that you're very familiar with, where they are not only burdened by marginalization socially, but by physical isolation as well. But this story is hardly unique to Vancouver, this particular kind of story. And I want to just tell you a little bit about Portland, a place I've been spending huge amounts of time over the last 4 or 5 years. And I'm going to guess that pretty much everybody in the room has been to Portland. And if you haven't been to Portland, you know about Portland. And the first time I started going there, I had the same experience that many people have when they arrive in Portland, which is, hey, hell, this is great. It's fantastic. There's bikes everywhere, nice, small, walkable neighborhoods, compact communities. There's beer everywhere. You can take your dog to the bar. It's a great place. Portland's lovely. I started thinking about it for a while. I was poking around, and I was like, well, there's something kind of, I'm having a great time. It's clear the city is made for kind of people like me, but what's the thing? And I was poking around, and I started thinking, I started asking after the black population. I said, well, like, I'm told that Portland is the whitest city in North America, and that's true by a very long shot. It's the only city in North America I can find without a single majority-minority neighborhood. I said, well, what are the circumstances that have led to that? And I started poking around and meeting community groups, and over the last 4 or 5 years, I've been spending a tremendous amount of time researching a neighborhood called Albina, which ironically enough is the single iconic black neighborhood in Portland. It's in the Northeast. I don't know if anybody is familiar enough to know where the Northeast is. Portland's kind of like on a grid, and the downtown core is in the south and northwest, and across the river, the Northeast has historically been an African-American area. And we start thinking about, why has there really only ever been one historical black neighborhood in Portland? You got to back up a little bit. And one of the things you find out right away is that Oregon has perhaps the most starkly and unapologetically racist history and a racist constitution outside of Alabama or Mississippi. The state of Oregon has been thought of and organized explicitly and absolutely in a written down, unapologetic way as a white utopian experiment. Right up until the late 1800s, black people, in fact, were not allowed in the state of Oregon at risk of whipping. They all had to rip across the border to Washington state to avoid corporal punishment, incarceration, or just straight violence. And in that context, Oregon, right up until the mid-1900s, was primarily a state that was incredibly hostile to black people. People of all kinds of people of color, but primarily to black people. And so by World War II, there was a community called Vanport, Vancouver and Portland and Vancouver, Washington, which was stuck right at the very top of Portland, right in the very northeast, right up by the Columbia River, that was a wartime community, largely developed for war production, that accepted people from all across the United States who were looking for work. And so that by the end of the Second World War, that was a community of about 40,000 people, about half of whom were African American, which was the largest concentration of black people in Oregon. Shortly after, I'm condensing some history quickly, but you'll get the point. Shortly after World War II, the population stayed, and there was a considerable effort to maintain the community of Vanport, because by that point, it had 40,000 people. It had shopping malls, it had movie theaters, it had schools, it had developed all the infrastructure of a community. Right after World War II, there was a flood. The Columbia River flooded and wiped the community out, and essentially everybody in Vanport had to evacuate on short notice. Most of whom poured into Portland, including something like 15,000 black people. But while Portland was welcoming of the refugees from Vanport, they were not so welcoming of black people. And in fact, through a whole series of community covenants, redlining, real estate restriction, community violence, and civic architecture, that black people were really only welcomed in one neighborhood, which is the northeast of Portland, which is the core neighborhood of the inner city of the core neighborhood of the northeast of Portland is called Albina. For those of you that are familiar, this would be more or less Mississippi and William Street running up to Alberta Street. And so that by the mid-1970s and 1980s, essentially about 90% of Portland's black population lived in this one small 2-mile area. And that small area was constricted even further by the construction of the Rose Quarter and the Convention Center down at the very bottom of Albina, which pushed black residents further up. In the late 1950s, the I-5 came down on the side of the community, which pushed black residents even further. Then the Emmanuel Hospital was built shortly after that, which condensed black people even into a smaller footprint. So that by 1990, where my story really begins, what you have is a neighborhood of Albina whereby the vast majority of Portland's black population is confined. So approximately 80% of that neighborhood's population is identified as black. But a neighborhood which has been constrained and restricted from moving out. Right up until the 60s, it was illegal for a real estate agent to sell a house in another part of the city to a black person or a Chinese person. The neighborhood is incredibly constricted. But not only is it constricted and constrained to a particular geographical area, that a long-held system of bank redlining meant that local residents were unable to fix up their houses. They were unable to get loans to fix up their houses. And so that the area by 1990 had, through a whole system of withdrawal of capital and civic intent, had reduced the area to what was, I think, very accurately called a ghetto in 1990. At this point, the city of Portland passes what's called the Albina Community Plan, which is an old school urban renewal plan, and begins to move black residents out of the neighborhood. So that in 1990, you have an area that is largely a ghetto and is just under 80% black. And through a whole series of instruments, primarily through moving into a place, they would come and say, hey man, your house is condemned. You need to fix this up, it's not fit for human habitation. And the resident will say, well, I don't have any money to do that, I can't do that. And they would say, okay, great, you have to move out. And they would say, well, where can I move? And they say, well, conveniently, I have some Section 8 housing for you. Some affordable housing, and here's some affordable housing vouchers for you to move into. And that housing that the PDX, the PDC, the Portland Development Commission, and the Portland Planning Department moved black residents out to was overwhelmingly out in the suburbs, out in the numbers, what they call, out in Gresham, up in Cooley, to neighborhoods at the periphery of the city. And in between 1990 and 2010, which are the last and best data that we have, the population of Albina declined from 75 to 79%, somewhere in that range, African American, depending on where you draw the borders. But the area was at least 3/4 black. 1990 to 2010, it declined to under 25% black. And when I talk about this, people are saying, hey, a second, did you say 1990? I thought you were talking about 1890. And I want to emphasize that this is now. This is ongoing still. We just don't have the data particularly past 2010. That in a very deliberate, very explicit effort, the city of Portland took its constrained black population and dispersed it. Took the neighborhood of Albina, which was 3/4 black, is now under 1/4 black and declining very steadily still. But they took that population, approximately 10,000 black people, and dispersed them all across to the far edges of the city. And very interestingly, what the census figures show is that that dispersal of the black population was almost exactly replaced by a white population. That in fact it was white people moving in very literally, metaphorically and socially, in the socially constructed space, but much more materially than that, moving in to take the houses of recently departed black people. And I will submit to you, I'm going to cut this, there's more to the story, and I will burden you with a little bit of it in a moment. But those are the brief outlines of what I want to talk about a little bit. And I want to submit to you that dispersal of population, in Portland's case of a highly racialized population, in Vancouver of low-income, working class, and immigrant populations, is not some unforeseen, unintended consequence, but is inherent to and bound up with what both cities claim to be success. As the NAACP Senior Director of Economic Programs, Dedrick Mohammed, wrote, he said, "The corrosive effect of gentrification can be found throughout the nation, even in the liberal, whitest city of America, Portland, Oregon. Portland is known internationally as a leader in urban design, with many boasting of its bike-friendly streets, accessible 20-minute neighborhoods, and quaint local business culture. Unbeknownst to many, however, Portland is also a case study in gentrification, a glaring reminder that urban economic disparities will persist as long as the structural inequalities of our economy remain." And I would in fact suggest that he's being polite there. That in fact, the idea that somehow that this was a mistake, that we just left the affordability out, is not only untrue, but duplicitous. I would suggest that the success of both Vancouver and Portland, in fact, depends on displacement. And in the context of this gathering, I'm interested in the idea of design. I'm interested in how design might position itself as something other, as something beyond bland exercises in the service of privilege, and that maybe design might understand itself as working in the service of difference. I'm going to hope that you're going to forgive me, and I'm going to do something I rarely do, but I'd like to read you just a little bit here from this new book that I just finished. Mainly because I want to read it. I'm tired of it not being out. This is a couple of pieces from the last chapter. And this is the, well, you get it. This is a couple pieces of the last chapter. I returned to Portland once again with a head full of sovereignty. I walk up and down Mississippi and North Williams repeatedly. I see street signs letting me know I've entered a historic district. I see eco-lofts, handcrafted living and Be Nourished, organic pet stores, many blonde kids, artisanal boutique this, local gallery that. I see white sorority types in a new Kia convertible blasting Lil Wayne, the thump ricocheting off the building for blocks either way. I see Louisiana-themed condo loft options, Bayou, Tupelo Alley, the Delta, something called vintage real estate. I stop and browse a Portlandia book and think about whiteness. I wander up Alberta Street and see a very attractive mural telling me, "You are only confined by the walls you build yourself." I think, fuck you. I encourage myself to resist overly hostile cynicism. They're probably nice people, and they probably mean well. They just didn't think that one out much. There's a Mardi Gras parade on Fat Tuesday, heavily advertised in a craft store called Gumbo. I get an Airbnb for a night right in the heart of the neighborhood. The hippie who owns the house mentions in the morning that she has a lot of gardening to do, including lifting some heavy rocks and stuff. She looks at me hopefully, waits an extra beat or two, and then says, "Fine, I'm gonna go get a Mexican for the day." I remind myself again about the hostile cynicism thing and find the affirmation difficult. Albina is not awful. Really, not even close. It's actually just beautiful, at least in its built form. The scale is admirable. There's a pleasing diversity of building typologies and ages. There's thoughtful transit, bike, and pedestrian-oriented developments. There are walkably spaced mini neighborhood centers. The housing stock is attractive and well-maintained. The food trucks pop up serendipitously, and there remain a number of solid community institutions, including the spectacular rebuilding center right in the middle of the Mississippi Business Strip. There's really plenty to admire here. But why are these kinds of design success stories seemingly inevitably on ethnically cleansed ground? Excuse me. Tired of gritting my teeth, I walk over to the North and Northeast Business Association World Headquarters in an old church just off Fremont to spend another afternoon with John, Joyce, and Fawn. I asked them about the heavily touted city plan for affordable housing construction and home ownership supports in Albina that the Portland Development Commission really hopes will tone down some of the rhetoric and activism in the neighborhood. John erupts with a stream of startlingly articulate profanity and describes gentrification as a three-headed lion with a long tail. As soon as you cut one of those heads off, another grows around while the tail whips around on you. He says that even if the city has some kind of success building affordable housing, even if that lot a few blocks away on Martin Luther King gets built out as promised, and even if they make those units available to low-income black residents, what kind of community would these people be getting now if they stay? Living in a place they can't afford and don't feel comfortable in? Paul Knowles is sitting there too, so I ask him what he thinks of this. Paul is the long-standing acclaimed mayor of the North and Northeast and a remarkable guy. He moved to Albina in 1963 and has lived in the neighborhood ever since. 84 years old, dressed on point and whip smart, he describes to me the 50-plus years of change he's seen in the neighborhood, including his career owning nightclubs. Now, since 1991, he and his wife, who recently passed away when we were talking, have run Geneva's Sheer Perfection and Beauty Parlor, still a center for black community life in Albina, still a drop-in spot for regulars and celebrities alike. He told me how the highway construction in the 50s forced residents and businesses further north and east, then about the stadium and hospital constructions that pushed more people out. And then the real black exodus, beginning in the 1990s, when urban renewal destroyed people's homes, but all the Section 8 affordable housing they were shuffled to was elsewhere, way out in suburban exclaves. I asked him if there was any hope for the neighborhood reviving itself as a black community, and he smiled gently at me. No, it's not coming back. So what if they build 1,000 new affordable homes here for black people? There's already more than 10,000 who've left. Paul has documented the 95 black-owned businesses that have failed or abandoned Albina, with only 5 remaining, and he can remember almost every address, every proprietor, and the circumstances of the enterprise's demise. We had everything we needed here: TV repair, dry cleaners, clubs, restaurants, grocery stores. It's all here. But the sad fact, he says, is that white people just won't support black businesses. Really, I say? Really? Is that really true? He holds my gaze for an extra beat and says, yeah, it's just true. After Paul leaves, John, Joyce, and I go back to talking about how housing action isn't enough, how it has to go hand in hand with economic stability. If there aren't enough black people living in Albina, then black community institutions and businesses can't make a go of it. But the opposite is true too.
that if there's not a critical mass of identifiably black-owned, black-run cultural and social institutions in the neighborhood, including business enterprises, then African-American folks don't have much reason to live here. Those questions, where to fight, who has a voice, and what land, what's worth clinging to, when it's time to let it go, what makes a place worth scrapping to, is equally true anywhere that's precarious, which is part of why so many indigenous land struggles are so compelling for so many of us. A faith and commitment in land that's so strong through absolutely disastrous assault and dispossession to keep insisting on land. There's a question here of commitment in an age of fluidity, a question of land and freedom, which in turn gestures towards the central question of this book. What's a city for? And one that self-consciously responds in small part to Lewis Mumford's famous essay, What is a City? In 1937, Mumford called the city a lot of things, including, quote, a related collection of primary groups and purposeful associations, a geographic plexus, an economic organization, an institutional process, a theater of social action, aesthetic symbol of collective unity. But at the heart of his vision was the idea of a city as a social staging ground, a performative area, a dramatic platform. Quote unquote, the city fosters art and is art. The city creates the theater and is theater. There's a lot to like about that urban story. A story of diversity, of vibrancy, the ballet of the sidewalk, and overflowing energy. Despite their long-held personal antagonisms, mostly because of Mumford's regrettable sexism, Jane Jacobs tended to echo Mumford with lyrical evocations of cities suffused with everyday diversity of uses and users in its everyday streets, of an urban public dance. This is quoting Jane Jacobs here. She writes, although it is life, not art, we may fancifully call it the art form of the city and liken it to the dance. Not to a simple-minded precision dance, but to an intricate ballet in which the individual dancers and ensembles all have distinctive parts, which miraculously reinforce each other and compose an orderly whole. And for generations now, this vision has acted as the normative, progressive narrative that designers and urbanists have constantly reverted to. The city as stage. They followed, or hoped to follow, or pretended to follow, Jacobs' prescriptions for exuberant diversity, multi-use districts and multiple function streets, short blocks, fine-grained typologies of building sizes, ages and conditions, dense concentration of peoples and activities, complete walkable neighborhoods. And in many places, Portland and Vancouver, maybe foremost among them, planners have found success. But what has it gotten us? A revived interest in non-autocentric design principles, lots of sweet, pretty urban communities, sophisticated planning techniques, some walkable, well-designed urban districts. And it's gotten us 3 decades of endemic gentrification and displacement. It's gotten us Albina, East Vancouver, the 9th Ward, Brooklyn, Mission, Murray, Baillieu, and every other neighborhood where capital pours in to take advantage of newly vulnerable but attractive stages. This good urban planning has got us cities remade, especially inner cities, as vestigial white utopias. As we sit here amid the intellectual wreckage of 30-plus years of new urbanism, we need to cast a critical gaze, not just on the results, but on the apoliticized diversity that animates it. An idea so thoroughly pulped that it can now be easily swallowed without chewing. My apologies. The liberal consensual fantasy of urban diversity has been reduced to one more accoutrement of privilege. It's perhaps once dangerous potentiality now leveraged in the service of bleached neighborhoods and capital accumulation. The vision of city as stage is fine, but only if it unfolds on itself, not as a choreographed dance, but as the built expression of difference that cannot be planned or marionetted, but emerges from the everyday lives of everyday people. Difference is an agonistic political idea that speaks to power, not design, to the city as battleground, not theater. The city has to speak to land directly. The urbanist imaginaria that reduces the city to ballet is what Portland and Vancouver are so celebrated of having got it right, while simultaneously clearing the most putatively livable parts of their urban landscapes of working and middle class, racialized and poor residents. This, of course, is what happens. What has to happen when a place insists on doing the design and staging well, but effectively ignores the antagonisms of power. A cleansed and securitized playground for privilege. Every city evinces and articulates varying patterns of displacement, oftentimes predictable, sometimes not at all. Sometimes systematic, sometimes not at all. Sometimes recognizable, sometimes not at all. In its current form, for example, Vancouver's patterns are less starkly racialized than in Portland, but more deeply invested in ongoing narratives of colonization and more pronounced housing market contortions. But each city seems committed to a continuous exercise of ahistoricity in the service of privilege. Jane Jacobs seemingly understood the implications of her prescriptions and on occasion gestured towards a more politicized urbanism. I'm quoting her here. She says, cities have the capacity of providing something for everybody, only because and only when they're created by everybody. But her quote-unquote created by everybody was always an amorphous, aestheticized cultural production disconnected from social antagonisms, which explains their beatification among liberal planners. The diversity Jacobs, and especially the new urbanists reify, is a misapprehension, a perversion of difference. What they're calling for is absolutely real and attractive. Lively public realms, complete mixed-use neighborhoods, pedestrian transit, bike-friendly streets, etc. These are all desirable built forms. But for these goals to be achieved with any resilience or ethics, they have to be the product of a city that disowns land, where profiteering and capital accumulation off of land is disavowed. Any city that achieves apoliticized but attractive design objectives while allowing its land to be left to the whims of the market will inevitably see its successes captured by capital and quickly destroyed or disemboweled. The neoliberal city is a vampiric city, constantly sucking the vibrancy out of its neighborhoods and keeping its most alive residents always on the precarious run. Diversity is the blandly securitized simulacrum of difference. The city has to constantly unfold onto itself as the creative production of sociability. But a city of difference can only exist where everyday people are not preyed upon, where land is not reduced to the market, which is why I'm tentative about deferring to gentrification as a driving trope of contemporary urban transformations. Antagonism to gentrification all too often strikes me as a defensive action, a working from the presumed inevitability of displacement and dispossession of self-determining subjectivities, and then trying to ameliorate the effects. I'll submit to you here that cities are uniquely constituted to meet that challenge, but more aggressively, on land that is not reduced to commodity. And we know how to do that. We know how to effectively remove land from the market, whether it's speculative or Georgia's taxes, non-market housing, squatting or co-ops, or any other configurations we can imagine. But cities can and should be the landed expression of a socially creative breach in dominatory logics, a breach that by definition seeks to repair the injustices its own existence is predicated on. That is what a city is for. I'm going to stop there for a second, but I want to stop reading there for a second. I'm almost done. Because there's one more little piece that I want to add to this story, this particular kind of story of design in the service of displacement. And that, of course, that both cities, both Vancouver and Portland, are predicated and very literally built on the clearance of Indigenous people. Vancouver is gripped by the realities of its coloniality. The city, this province, from one end to the other, is situated on unceded Indigenous territory. The basis of all our property law, and thus all our law, is the unlawful seizure of Indigenous land, a reality which court decisions like the Chilcotin decision are just beginning to grasp now. Portland is very similar. The state of Oregon was notorious, even before it began clearing out black residents, for settler brutality towards Indigenous residents, even in an era of widespread white barbarism. And in 1850, the Oregon Donation Land Act forcibly removed all Indigenous people and offered indigenously held land free to any white settlers, who within 7 years had claimed 2.5 million acres of it, including all of the current city of Portland. That was in 1850. The city of Portland was founded in 1851. American denial of Indigenous citizenship was maintained until 1924, but in many states, Oregon included, refused to recognize Indigenous voting rights until the federal government stepped in with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. More than 60 tribes in Oregon were terminated by the federal government in 1953, consolidated into larger affiliations, or simply eradicated. So if Vancouver and Portland are currently being driven and defined by successive waves of displacement, they are walking a well-worn historical trail. And I guess I'd like to close with maybe a question about all of that for all of us. And surely now that the history of colonialism is mercifully behind us, and really all this displacement, really isn't it just capitalism's fault? Something that too big for us to deal with? Isn't this all really bigger than all of us? How can any of this displacement, how can it be the fault of designers? How can it be the fault of academics or architects? How can it be the fault of organizers or activists like me? Should we blame ourselves? Should we somehow be valiantly, somehow thinking that we could shoulder responsibility? And my short answer is, yeah, we should be. We should be taking responsibility for settler colonialism and predatory capitalism. And I mean that in a very specific, very, very direct sense. Because if it ain't us,
And I mean, when I mean us, I mean me and you. I mean people sitting in this room. If it's not us going to be taking responsibility for that, well, who is? Who might possibly be able to? Pointing fingers, shaming ourselves, caving into doubt, turtling, cowering from the challenge, that's of little interest to me. But I would call on my designer, my architect, and my academic friends, just like I call on my activist and organizer colleagues and pals. And I guess, honestly, more than anybody, I call on myself. And I mean that very specifically and unadornedly. I call on myself, just like I call on all of our friends, to put politics first. Specifically and aggressively, I'm calling for a class politics. I'm calling for a critical race theory. I'm calling for a commitment to decolonization before any desire to create a pretty bauble of a city for rich patrons. Because really, honestly, if all our efforts, if all our hard work, if all our care and our love aren't directly, aggressively, unapologetically confronting inequality, unearned privilege, and social domination, if all of our work and effort, if all our life's effort is not put toward those goals, then what are we doing? What's all this work for? I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much, friends. I appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if I got that done in time, but thank you very much for your indulgence. I really appreciate that, folks.
You did, and that'll give us a few minutes for you to field some reactions and some questions. So,
right. As I said earlier, I don't want any hard questions. No questions from any smarty pants out there. Just really like softballs, please.
So claim the microphone if you'd like to react or ask a question.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting talk. My name's Mary Tassi. I'm a planner and a public art consultant, and I've worked in Vancouver and North Vancouver and Calgary. So I sat on Planning Commission from 2006 for 7 years. I was on school board at the time, so I had a lot of statistics about we need larger housing, like 3-bedroom units. And myself and another colleague, there's 7 people on commission. So you multiply my city by another 12, 15 planning commissions around the mainland. Every single time we asked for that 3rd unit, which would have made things affordable, right? They could have rented out the room. The speaker spoke earlier that could be a suite to rent out for affordability. Every single time the developers said no, and Planning Commission did not make the recommendation every single time. So when you say, why have these things happened about affordability? So I'm saying at the street level, at the policy political level, we didn't have the leadership. 2 people can't fight with 4 other people on Planning Commission. So that's something I just want to put out there. That's how these things happen. In terms of the Indigenous issue, that is history. What was changed by British government, so the history books of the last 100 years make the Indigenous people out to be not who they were. I've just written a book on this, of the original journals, totally different than what's in the history books. Captain Vancouver and the chiefs and kings, high-level, respectful social relationships, not what's in the history books that we've all learned about for the last 100 years. So that's the subtext of where those prejudices come from. So I just want to say those 2 things. I'm sure there's other questions. Excellent talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Anybody else? Here's one.
Hello? Hi. Okay, well, I'll stand up. Hi, Matt. I'm Amelia, and I'm actually on this year's board for Car Free Day Vancouver. Yeah, but we're coming up to this discussion now, and it happens kind of cyclically every year. We're ramping up our efforts for the festivals, and I sit on specifically the site for the drive. So I know you're kind of smiling a little bit because the drive it's a very contentious space. And And the society itself is evolving into different roles. You know, we want to be more of an advocate, and we don't want to be the people who are just there to throw a good party. But the question is, what are we celebrating, right? We've reached kind of this impasse where, you know, the city benefits from our activities. You know, a lot of people look forward to it, but at the same time, it's like, who do the communities look forward to it? The Drive BIA, they have their Italian days the week before the commercial car-free day, and it's kind of turning us into a contentious issue with the neighborhoods BIA. So it's kind of strange. I guess my question is, you know, knowing that you stepped away from the entire situation a few years ago, and we're reaching this point where we're realizing we're doing all this, but for who, really? I mean, we're trying to compete with a lot of other festivals that are coming up in the city. Catalano Festival, Greek Days, Italian Days, and we're trying to compete for, you know, vendor sponsorship, all those sorts of things, and we're starting to be inundated by all these logistics. Some people would argue that we're losing some of our original flavor. Well, have been for quite a while, right? So this year we're thinking of taking the Drive off a different date altogether, maybe doing a collaboration with the Great Grandview Garage Sale and making it a little bit more, not just as linear, but more kind of web-like across. So, but I thought I'd ask you what your thoughts are on it.
Well, thanks. Yeah, that'd be great.
Thank you, man. Thank you, sir. Probably screwing up that.
Well, thanks a lot. Well, firstly, thanks for sitting on keeping going. And secondly, I would say, do not worry about holding to the original vision or whatever. I'm not a big fan of nostalgia. And I organized those festivals for a number of years, and I left, not because I didn't love them, because I kind of ran out of ideas in a lot of ways. I was like, I'm not sure I got any more good ideas here. Somebody else needs to start carrying this. So I'm really glad you are. Thank you. Yeah, and what you articulated, I'm going to not really answer your question, I'm afraid, because the question's a really good one, which is to say, yeah, and that's what I noticed. The more success of the car-free days, you know, at its peak when I was engaged with it, it was 250,000 people in 4 neighborhoods across the city, and very literally what it was doing was bringing in hordes of people from across the city who were wandering up and down Commercial Drive going, wow, this is a lovely spot, maybe I could stay here. Maybe, you know, look how cheap, you know, it's considerably cheaper part of the city. And I was paralyzed in many ways by the contradictions of what I was doing. I guess the only thing I could ask was that you, well, no, that's not ask. I would just say that I'm really glad that you are considering them as sincerely as I was. And I don't have really any good suggestion about that because we're placed on such a conundrum as any kind of community organizer. And the question I often ask myself is maybe for those 2 decades of working in East Vancouver, maybe I should have been making it worse. If I'd been making it worse, maybe I should have been opening a Burger King. Maybe I should have been advocating for street widenings. Maybe I should have been chucking garbage around. Then at least maybe my kids could have stayed there. And I've rented the same house for 18 years. And like most of us, you know, there's a huge amount of anxiety about my tenure in the neighborhood after that ends, whenever that might end. Not yet, John. Hold on. Yeah, and so all I can say is that, yeah, I agree with you. And if I had any better answers, I swear I'd offer them. But thank you for keeping them going. Those are, at the very least, I appreciate them now because they're a fun day. It's a great day. It's a riot. Actually, I wish it was a riot, maybe. But
I have a question. My name is Anastasia Lukairu-Sideris, and I'm working at UCLA. And with colleagues from Berkeley and UCLA, we have completed a study recently looking into the impact of transportation investments and TODs on displacement. And what we found was that we found neighborhoods where you saw a lot of displacement and neighborhoods where you did not see displacement. And the neighborhoods where you did not see displacement, they had a common denominator. And the common denominator were rent control policies, anti-eviction policies, anti-condominium conversions. It was not so much an issue of design, it was very much an issue of anti-displacement policies. So I guess the question I have is, because I don't know the Vancouver context, is if there are some of these policies in the books, here, in Vancouver or Portland.
is that on? Okay, yeah. The answer is no, not really, and absolutely not sufficient. But I would agree with you, Anastasia, that is my conclusion after some time thinking about this, is that the only route forward for really aggressively thinking about displacement is to think about land as a non-market common good. And I will expand on that at some length in some other forum, but I will not burden you with that now. But I believe that there's a whole number of mechanisms that need to be invoked. Some of them are taxation, the push of taxation. Some of them are the pull of creation of non-market housing across a whole wide range of scales, from affordable housing to social housing to limited equity to community land trusts, et cetera. But I believe that that is the only real legitimate route forward. I would concur with you. Thank you.
One more question over here. Two questions, but quick.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jacqueline Steckler.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, ma'am?
Jacqueline Steckler. I've moved here from Portland, Oregon. I lived in Portland from the 70s into the 90s. I can say about Albina that it's been an experiment for a very long time. And part of what you're describing is the history of urban renewal in North America. And how, in fact, the Rose Quarter became the Rose Quarter, without mentioning how 405 did away with the whole Italian community in Portland as well. I think it's endemic to all the cities in the Northwest, inclusive of Vancouver, Seattle, and Portland, that the displacement has occurred. And I just wonder, from your point of view, because you're visiting down in Portland, how you see the two different systems addressing the displacement, the two different city systems, because of course city of Portland does not have a strong mayor, city of Vancouver does.
I'm sorry, Jacqueline, and that's a really interesting and long question. And I mean, honestly, I don't really see them addressing it in any substantive way, frankly speaking. So there's not a tremendous amount of comparison there. But it's not just the cities in the Northeast or the Northwest. It's cities across North America that are experiencing almost very, very similar patterns of displacement and dispossession. And you're right. Of course, I left out. There's tremendous layers of history there, right? The history of Albina, the history of the Rose Quarter, the history of the I-5, the history of Emmanuel Hospital. Just even in that one little district, are remarkable. The patterns. And I guess the only thing I would just say for now, and it's a bit trite, but Portland, one of the reasons I got so interested in Portland, partially because I just end up being there a lot. I've probably been there, I don't know, a couple dozen times in the last 4 or 5 years, but because it was so anomalous to me, is how could this happen in the putatively most liberal city in North America? And so I spent a lot of time trying to get in touch with Charlie Hales, who is the signatory on the Albina Renewal Plan. And is the current mayor of Portland, and is a very Gregor-like figure, a very nice, handsome, charming guy with liberal politics. And he, I don't know what the technical term is. I think the closest I would say is like, he fucking hates me. Like, he hates me, and he will not talk to me about it. But that's very different from many other people in Portland, because what the experience of so many people and so many organizers and so many activists in Portland are is what my friend Walida Imarisha, who's featured a lot in my writing these days, calls death by listening. That Portland is incredibly adept at community forums, at participatory listening exercises, at all kinds of city, like I was at a city forum in Albina in 2015 where Charlie Hales gave a beautifully eloquent speech regretting the displacement of the African American population of Albina, acknowledging it, talking about it, and then doing nothing. The Emmanuel Hospital has an unbelievably sophisticated history in this, an unbelievably sophisticated and very articulate PR program, acknowledging the detrimental effects of the hospital on the neighborhood. They even have a little I don't know if you've been in the Emmanuel Hospital, they have a little historical museum with pictures of the black community that used to be on the site of the hospital, and yet will contribute nothing to community groups. And so I'd say it's a very particular kind of phenomenon that I'm interested in, both in Portland and Vancouver, which have events very particular and very articulate liberal political milieus, and then just carry on as if nothing happened. Not dissimilar to many of which, and some people like, for example, Gregor, who I like tremendously personally, will say all kinds of really interesting things, and yet nothing changes. That's what I have for you now.
Okay. You've been standing for quite a while, so
Sorry about that.
give us your question.
I'll be quick. Hi, Matt. I'm Rebecca.
Hey, Rebecca, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you? I'm a recent SCARP graduate. Unfortunately, I didn't take your course. I wanted to. I work as a development planner at a local city, and I appreciate that you finished your talk pointing to settler colonialism and the burden of responsibility being on us as practitioners to actively participate in the process of decolonization. I can say that's a focus of SCARP here, and in my 10 months being a practicing planner, I have not come across ways to really incorporate that meaningfully into how I work, and I could say that my work maybe has the opposite effect. So I'm wondering if in small, tangible ways you have any recommendations for people like me and urban designers and architects who work in this field, and it's not the focus of their work to incorporate the process of decolonization and implementing that in our work environment, please.
I do.
Okay, great.
Excuse me. I have one very small suggestion, and that is make friends. I spend a lot of my time thinking about words like friendship and hospitality and generosity. Those are at least 3 words that I really feel like I can stand on and I can think about carefully. And I place an inordinate amount of political value on friendship. And so my suggestion to you would be start making friends. Start making friends with Indigenous people. Start making friends with Indigenous people who live on reserve and people who live off reserve. And that's a hard process. It takes a lot of time, a lot of uncomfortableness, a lot of awkwardness, a lot of time sitting in community forums that you're like, why am I here? A lot of complicated feelings. But the encounter with difference has to be, in many ways, an encounter with difference that is instigated by people like you and me. And that the more that we can encounter people that are not like us, in particular in the context of your question, Indigenous people, and become friends, then I think that we might have a shot at actually listening. That would be my only suggestion for now, but congratulations and thank you, and congratulations on your employment.
Thank you.
Nicely done.
Thank you, Matt. And let's give Matt another hand for a great talk.